I interviewed close to 285 people who gave me the exact starting lineup, how many there were, and the finish lineup. The difference is the people who have died.
Their tragedy, what happened to them?
There you go, and I noted the date of departure, the date of arrival, the place where the people died, how they were executed. What about dates of birth? We counted close to 780 people who died, statistics to back it up, and that at least the elements are there, the scientific data, no one cannot.
Challenge them.
So we have all these elements that we have transmitted to the international community. The racer, whose mandate is to protect refugees, they were well aware, they reported to whomever they were entitled to in Geneva and at the United Nations.
We had already announced that it is a series of testimonies, but because obviously we have to tell the story of Congo to this young generation, which probably is not.
To find out what happened in Congo, the crimes against humanity that were committed in Congo, this young generation, but also the adults who were not on the ground, who did not experience these events, who heard about them, but who do not really have the true perception of these events, especially of these crimes against humanity or the international community had.
Completely closed eyes or a media blackout. Today, we must remind the international community, the Congolese, of this story. It all started in December 1998. Where are you and what's going on, and how do you finally end up in these villages, in the bush, until you end up in the DRC?
Thank you very much, Mr. Christian. Indeed, after the victory of Minister Sassou Nguesso in October 1997, I was living at the time in Kinsuni, and I was obliged to move and go live in Brono, where the conditions I found were reliable. And unfortunately, in view of the events which were worsening in the Pool region, insecurity began to persist in the southern neighborhoods of Brazzaville, so there since Bono. Notice that people were already moving towards Bakongo, and especially when they learned that the Cobras who were installed in the Joey Round and also in Gangaligolo began to execute summarily the inhabitants. So, in fact, everything I was afraid of.
And when you say the Cobras started to execute civilians, that is anyone who found it in their path, of course. Men, women, young, old civilians were executed. It is.
That, yes, they were executed. It was the civilians they were executing. They even went to a church where people were paying. And there was a church within a church. They killed all the people who were there. And among these members of the population was my landlord, whom I could not even see until then because he was killed. There was also my landlord who was part of this,
this one in the church.
Yes, who was in the church after that? I told myself no, that you had to move.
Are you going to forgive me, Mr. Jean-Pierre Gohi, the Protestant church? Can you situate it for us? Where was she like that?
It is a church that is located in the regions of Gangalingolo. Thank you, yes. So following that, I told myself that there was a danger, that it was therefore necessary to move, to go back to the Makaline district. I took my children and my wife, they were 3-4 earlier, and we went back to Gangalingolo, more towards marking the Kellys. There was no traffic, there were no vehicles. I took my bags, my luggage, I put in a wheelbarrow, and as a precaution, I took my last daughter, who was still 2 years old. I strapped it to my back simply to protect myself, so that, by the way, I would kill. I am not actually assimilated to ninjas, as I said, since they call them gels. All chicken successes have ninja potential, and so I took my childhood, the Miaudo, with my bag, and we crossed. We went to the pharmacy, which was located even at the Play Bridge, so 100 men away. My brother is inhabited. We went to his house, we stayed, and at night, I assure you, there was a cacophony of weapons. Who happened there at Dieu Bridge? We knew. Is that what the cost of summoning was? Is that what a war was? Interrogation? It doesn't matter. And we had taken our precautions. Who behind the wall? Who under the bed? And so it's the basic whistling. And around 3 hours in the morning, it will calm down. And in the morning, very early with my two brothers, we said, well, listen, things have calmed down, so we're going to go out and go buy something to eat, and also at work, check a little if we're working. And as soon as we leave the plot, it's a big black one that we talk about, reports. He has us. He has us. He says, you, where are you going? He puts the bar on the cannon. I tell him, but what's going on? I made it clear to you that we are going to work. Said, good, give money where to play Abati. I figured it was better to save his life than to keep the money we had. Fortunately for me, I had 2,000 to 1,000 CFA francs in my pocket. I went out, I took out the 2,000 francs, I gave it to him, and he told us, take this way, go straight, don't take it against me. Because on the other side, there's like you risk getting killed. And so we continued. Continue to burning Lom. We didn't go according to plan. I went to the Total market to make purchases and go home. And suddenly, around 10 June, there were screams, and I said to myself, we must quickly go back to the Bridge of God and take the family and go back in the long rallying. When they left, I took the family across. What desolation. What a spectacle. Corpses were lying on the ground. Many were killed. Civilians even lying on the ground. And we continued because we had to buy time. What? And some time later, shells began to fall in pseudo neighborhoods. Then, of course, the bridge to kill. We kept going.
Mr. Jean-Pierre Angouy, you are telling us that during this, I don't know how to describe it, well, we must call it a genocide. And so we used heavy weapons, that is to say shells, rockets to fire on working class neighborhoods, right?
Yes, indeed. And therefore, we also return a good name. I was joined by a friend, MP Jacques Milongo, who came with his family. There were at least 40 of them, and I interned them at my house. We stayed all night. In total, there were less than 60 people, and the next morning, he took his entire delegation, therefore his family members, and he continued, and so it was the 19th. They left, and I was left alone. On the night of the 19th, in the night of the 18th to the 20th, there were shells which also began to fall in the neighborhoods, in the southern neighborhoods. There in Monod, I said to myself, I told the family, we must leave. We gathered objects, and I left for a 7-month trip in the Po region. So a trip.
Where do you mean a forced journey? Is that it?
Is exactly a forced journey. So we made a first stop at the fish station of Dumuna on the 20th, 12/9/98 in the evening. We spent the
20th of December, 1998.
Yes, 98, yes, with the Dumuna family, and we continued the day in Bisiza, where we spent 2 weeks.
And there it was a little quieter, it was.
Calmer? Yes, it was at the end of December. We will. It's a little quieter. But unfortunately, 2 weeks later, the shells started to fall at Isolo. So crossing Bisinza, and the shells were going to fall at Isolo. which means that the military was already stationed. At Gangalingolo, they were shooting towards Isolo, indicating they had crossed Jué.
They had crossed the Jué, right?
They had already crossed the Jeet since the population was evacuated, and the population was already living in the Great Pole. So that's what happened. And so 2 weeks after the canoe hits, following the oblique that fell at the Isolo, we moved. We said, no, we have to leave. And from there we kept going. In Luengo, in the center, the Tebaï du Christian of Father Christian Labrediès, La Bretèche. And there we lived for 4 months. During this period, we saw helicopters and shot at the population. So a helicopter that was bombing. And on another helicopter, there were soldiers fighting that was good and shooting at the civilian population that was moving. Then I thought it had to get more serious. We really had to move. And it was also in Luengo that we learned that during the clashes that took place at the Inso, there were many combatants who had died. And among these soldiers who had died, they have identified ex-FAS, Mobutu, Central Africans, Chadians, Zimbabweans, Rwandans from their identity document. So then,
if I understand correctly, I will try to recapitulate. When you arrive in this village, you realize there was finally clash with Ben, the young people of the village, who tried to resist this military expedition. And so they still got to Ben, let's say, eliminate some cobras. And among these cobras, we find mercenaries. They should be called originals. From the DRC, did you say from which other country?
Central African Republic, Chad.
From Chad.
Zimbabwe, Rwandans.
Rwandan.
So that's what happened at the factory. So when we heard about it, we thought, listen, this is getting worse than this. So we had to leave. So with this advance of the fighting, we were obliged to leave Luengo at night. Going therefore with the father Briteshe him. Let's take Perib to Wonguta, and we went by gang to Kobo King, Kala and Goliba, and we stayed in Wonguta actually from late April 99 until July 99. This is due to the health deterioration of my children. And of myself too. We decided to leave Bogota to go for the crossing to the RSC. We went to Mandombe where we lived. We were practically 200 people who wanted to cross through Kiazi, Maji and Mazakaka. And this trip, we did it for 3 days. And after Mandombe, we negotiated, we went by bike, and from Bello, we got the green light for a crossing on July 17, 99. And we went to the village we called Neighbor. We were received by the inhabitants who, after 2 days of the day, after the 2 days we spent in Wanza, there was a delegation from the ACR that came to pick us up. They took us to Gombe Mataki, and there it is, and so...
That means Mr. Jean-Pierre Gouy. Does that mean you did? You made this crossing on foot, right? No, we walked across.
Yes, it's by canoe. Of course, it's by canoe. Yes, because the bike to the river, we did it on foot. But at the level of the river, there were canoes. So there were fishermen who were there, who made them cross for money. Everyone who wanted to go to the DRC, and me too. Indeed, I was lucky. I had the village chief of Branzak who came to pick me up and who took us in St. Pilog to sail in St. Pilog on the other side of the river.
Yes, but before you get there, we're going to go back a little bit. We are still in the chicken villages. Is it true that afterwards there were clashes, you said, with young people who wanted to resist this military expedition? Was there also a lot of loss of life? Civilians? Yes.
There has been a lot of loss of life, and that's it. I'll tell you about it at length. But as long as I arrived, because I had to give testimonies, I gave a lot of testimonies, which allowed me to have the statistics. Some numbers gave a number in miniature. No one was killed.
So that's it, since we're going to get back to it. So you arrived on the other side of the shore. So in the DRC, is that it?
Yeah, I'm on the other side of the shore in the DRC, in the village of Wanza. 2 days later, a delegation from the HR will pick us up at the village of Wanza to clear Matadi. And in Gombe, Mata said, indeed, they asked everyone who wanted to leave the city by arms, who wanted to stay in the refugee camp. And I opted to stay in the refugee camp. But there is a strong reaction from some. I was wondering, but why don't you go to the city? Is because you know something. I told him, no, there's insecurity. I can't go back to the end of everything I've been through. So it's better to go to the camp, stay until it calms down, and I could go back to the city, and not right now. And so I stayed 2 weeks. We stayed 2 weeks in Gome Matadi in the Yasser camp, and were transferred on July 29th, 1999, to the refugee camp. And from July 29, it was another life that began at the camp, seeing the number already left there, murderous, weakened, even suffering. I thought it was serious. And then people started to complain. There were delegations that came to listen to the refugees, and I followed them carefully. So it was sickening. Sorry. It is unfortunate to hear what had happened in the other villages, because
This what happened? What was it?
Saidia, you
Give some examples of what you followed.
You said?
What had happened? What was said? What exactly?
Yeah, what happened on the like side of town. Let us take, for example, the example of what happened in Misafo, at the mass grave of Misafo. Whole families were arrested. They were forced to dig holes, and the whole family would go down the hole. And they were exterminated, they were shot, and more than 800 holes were counted, where the entire families of 234 or even 5 people were buried in the satellite beam of 1101. Incredible genocide, a mass grave, those who refused to dig. The holes were transported 100 meters away to the edge of a ravine, and they were executed, they were shot. It was awful. There were more than 1,000 people who were killed on this ravine. So in total, when you counted those who were buried in the holes and those who were shot at the edge of the ravine, this is close to 3,043,500 people. Desolation. Excuse me, sir.
Jean-Pierre Angoy, you are telling us that the men have uniforms sent by the Congolese government. You have to say it like that. So because he is the one who has just carried out the military coup, who therefore took power, and in front of him there is no opponent, there is no one who hinders him, but in 1998 he decided to launch such an operation, if we have to say genocide. And so these soldiers there enter the chicken, arrest the civilians. Families ask these people to dig the holes, as you said, and we finish them. They are buried in these times, those who refuse to do so. They're transported 100 meters away next to a ravine, and they're finished there.
civilians, unarmed people.
Unarmed. Indeed, it is a group of cobras that was stationed at Misabot. There were almost 1,000 soldiers who were there actually providing security. But in reality, it was not security. But since their mission was to exterminate the population. And so families that were arrested, interrogated, were routed to this satellite beam. They were forced to dig holes. Dad, mom, children, grandchildren cough in the hole. They were executed. It is a genocidal. And that's unforgettable. And that's what actually forced me to gather all these facts in the form of a testimony that I gave to the camp manager, who the latter had transmitted to a delegation of the United Nations, the origin of Geneva, who had come to the camp because he was a relative. It's scary. It's amazing. I could not imagine that there were such crimes going on before the coup. That's right, fights, that's something else. But innocent, unarmed civilians. In addition to women, children were summarily executed. It's irritable and it's amazing. And that, I think...
Sir, I'm going to come back a little bit before you get to this point. You said once you crossed earlier, you made your crossing. You were welcomed on the other side of the shore, that is to say, in the DRC, and you were therefore transported to a refugee camp. Some people actually suggest you go back. Congo-Brazzaville, I don't know, but then you thought it wasn't prudent because for security reasons. That's what you said, and somewhere people told you why you don't go back to Brazzaville. It's because you know something about it.
Is it really the case?
Since you refused to go back to Brazzaville, what is the reason?
There are still those who had agreed to leave Burgundy there.
There are many who have returned. There are many who have returned because there have been many refugees too, not only from France, from Gombe and Matabi, but there are also those who left from Rosie, who were sent to Kinshasa, and other civilians who were brought manu militari by General Bouissamantoko from Kasangolo to Kinshasa. They were interned at the Brazzaville consulate in Kitambo Long Point, which was the Kitambo store.
Of these people, obviously we are talking about 350 public disappeared, but even though the figure is not exact, it is an approximate figure.
An approximate figure? Exactly. So there's more to it than that.
These young people were brought back to Brazzaville to finish them off. The story of Des Disparus du Beach. For those who do not know it, it is therefore the young people who had obviously fled the hostilities in the pool, who ended up in the DRC, who had been asked to return, unfortunately.
Those who returned to Brazzaville were welcomed at Brazzaville Beach. They were put in containers 45 feet away, locked alive. Then I was at the river.
Yes, exactly, one of the survivors of the beach. It actually reports several civilians who were arrested since from the beach, and that the case had been forwarded to the general staff. There were two containers where these refugees were actually stored. They stayed there before we went to the containers. They were imprisoned in buildings. Somewhere there were 3 buildings where really civilians were crammed.
So if I understood these young people correctly, we asked them to return to Brazzaville while, of course, guaranteeing their safety. They accepted, they took, so I don't know if it's by boat.
They are on the other side of Congo-Brazzaville. They are sorted, placed in buildings. We keep them in the buildings first, and then we're going to lock them up. In the containers?
In the containers?
Where they were welded containers and thrown into the river.
We put containers all around, tires. We poured gasoline, and they set the fire. And when you heard people praying inside, so there were people locked up and 6,000 locked up who were burned and died. And to distinguish traces, that's why it was. I was in the river, I was stunned, disgusted. I thought to myself, what an evil spirit were his others, and be able to do this. But when I read Talan, the program at the Rebara, I did understand that there were genocidal extermination strategies planned by the government. It is.
The government?
There has never been a politician as sadistic as this one. The one who planned, who programmed the program, who is never known. A politician who sets up a program of extermination of his own population in Africa. This is for the first time. So it's intoxicating, it's incredible. And that I don't know, one day at a time, when we could go to the country, we have to tell the story of a family, make all these available to the parents.
What is curious about this case is that crimes against humanity, let's put it that way, which had been committed on the beach of Brazzaville, were or are the subject of a trial which began in Brazzaville and which was, I believe, relaunched at the level of Paris. And since then, it's been total silence. So we don't understand exactly what's going on. These are crimes against humanity recognized as such. What exactly is gravity and what is happening here? This often raises the question of why France remains silent in the face of these crimes against humanity. Mr. Jean-Pierre Angouli, while all this is unfolding, you are still in the DRC, informed and receiving testimonies. Was the ACR, which obviously dealt with the Congolese refugees from Brazzaville who had ended up in the DRC, not informed of all this?
Testimonies of everything that happened in the pole. Indeed, there was a report which was made in the sense that we transmitted, which the authorities of the camp transmitted to the ACR to inform it of everything that was happening on the Brazzaville side. Because it was incomprehensible that the international community remained insensitive to this fact, to these tragic events that took place in the City Congress, to the extent that viable documents were made available to them. They were told everything that happened. And without hiding it from you, there was still an exhaustive census of the deaths that took place in the city. I interviewed nearly 285 people who provided precise details about the starting lineup, the number of participants, and the finish lineup. The difference is the people who died during this period.
Tragedy.
There you go. And I noted the date of departure, the date of arrival, the place where the people died, how they were executed. And what about the dates of birth? We counted nearly 780 people who died, backed by supporting statistics. The evidence is conclusive and scientific data supports it.
Challenge them?
So we have all these elements that we have transmitted to the international community, the RACER, whose mandate is to protect refugees. They were well aware, they made their report to whoever had the right to generate as to the United Nations.